My name is Clara Reed, and I'm 29 years old. Last fall, I spent 4 days camping alone in Echo Canyon, a desolate corner of Trabuco Canyon in Southern California. I went there chasing a story, a ghost story to be precise. What I found instead still haunts me to this day. I tell you this not to scare you, but to warn you. Some echoes should remain unanswered. I arrived at the trailhead late on a Tuesday afternoon. My RV rattled over the dirt road as I navigated past jagged outcroppings of rock and clusters of dry brush. The air smelled of sage and dust, and the sun was already dipping low, casting long shadows over the canyon. Echo Canyon was infamous for its dark history. In the late 1800s, a landslide buried a small mining settlement here, killing dozens of workers. Locals claimed their restless spirits still wandered the canyon, their voices carried on the wind. That kind of folklore was perfect for my work as a freelance writer specializing in the paranormal. I didn't believe in ghosts, but I'd made a career out of investigating them. I parked my RV in a small clearing near the entrance to the abandoned settlement. The place was eerily quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the low hum of the wind brushing against the rocks. I unloaded my camera, voice recorder, and a flashlight. This was going to be my home for the next few days, and I felt both excitement and unease as I surveyed the terrain. The first day passed uneventfully. I explored the remains of the settlement, crumbling cabins, rusted tools, and the yawning black mouth of a mining shaft carved into the hillside. The air inside the shaft was cold and damp, carrying the faint metallic scent of old stone. I made a mental note to return with better lighting equipment. As the sun set, I settled by the RV with my laptop and notes. That's when I heard it for the first time. A faint whisper, carried on the wind. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but then it came again, clearer this time. "Clara!" The sound froze me in place. It wasn't loud or aggressive, but it was unmistakably my name. I stood and scanned the area with my flashlight. The beam illuminated nothing but rocks and scrub brush. "Hello?" I called, my voice trembling slightly. The only answer was the low howl of the wind. I retreated into the RV and locked the door. I told myself it was a trick of the canyon's acoustics, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching me. The next morning, I woke early and decided to hike to the ridge overlooking the canyon. The trail was narrow and uneven, but the view from the top was breathtaking. The rolling hills stretched out like a sea of gold and green, and the settlement below looked like a forgotten memory. As I made my way back to camp, I decided to check out one of the old miners' cabins I hadn't explored yet. The door creaked on rusted hinges as I stepped inside. Dust motes danced in the beams of sunlight streaming through the cracks in the walls. That's when I saw it. My name, etched into the wood of the cabin's far wall. Clara. The letters were rough, as though carved hastily with a knife. My stomach dropped. I stepped closer, running my fingers over the grooves. The wood was weathered and brittle, but the carving looked fresh, as if it had been done recently. I hadn't seen anyone else in the canyon since I'd arrived. Who could have done this? That night, the canyon came alive. I was reviewing the photos I'd taken earlier when I noticed something strange. In one of the shots of the mining shaft, there was a faint glowing outline of a figure. It was barely visible, just a hazy silhouette in the darkness. I told myself it was a trick of the light, a flaw in the image, but deep down, I wasn't so sure. Then the whispers started again, louder this time. "Clara." It wasn't just my name now. I heard fragments of sentences, voices overlapping in a cacophony of sound. Some were soft and pleading, others angry and accusing. They echoed off the canyon walls, bouncing back to me in a distorted, endless loop. I grabbed my voice recorder and stepped outside, determined to capture the phenomenon. As soon as I hit record, the whispers stopped. The silence was deafening, oppressive, like the canyon itself was holding its breath. I stood there, waiting, my flashlight sweeping across the rocks. That's when I heard the footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from somewhere behind me. I spun around, but there was no one there. The footsteps stopped when I stopped. When I moved, they moved. I ran back to the RV, slammed the door, and locked it, my heart pounding in my chest. The next morning, I decided to search the cabins again, desperate for answers. In one of the smaller structures near the edge of the settlement, I found an old leather-bound journal tucked under a pile of rubble. The pages were yellowed and brittle, but the writing was still legible. The entries were frantic, written by a miner in the weeks before the landslide. He described hearing voices in the night, seeing figures in the shadows, and feeling a constant, oppressive presence. His final entry read, "Don't trust the echoes, don't look back." As I read those words, a chill ran down my spine. I stuffed the journal into my bag and hurried back to camp. That night, I woke to a strange light filtering through the RV's window. I stepped outside to see glowing orbs floating above the canyon floor, like spectral lanterns. They moved in unison, leading toward the mining shaft. Against my better judgment, I followed them. As I approached the shaft, the air grew cold, and the faint smell of smoke filled my nostrils. Suddenly, the ground beneath me began to rumble. Rocks tumbled down the hillside as a deafening roar filled the air. It was as if the landslide was happening all over again. I fell to my knees, clutching my ears as ghostly figures emerged from the shaft. Their faces were blurred, their movements jerky and incomplete, like a recording on an old broken tape. They screamed and clawed at the air, trapped in an endless replay of their final moments. "Help us," one of them whispered, its voice an echo of despair. I ran back to the RV, but the whispers followed me. They grew louder, more insistent, forming words that burrowed into my mind. "Stay with us, don't leave." I grabbed the journal and flipped to the final pages, desperate for some kind of solution. That's when I found it. A small, hand-drawn map showing the location of a token buried near the mining shaft. The entry claimed it was the key to ending the echoes. With no other option, I grabbed my flashlight and headed back to the shaft. I found the token buried under a loose pile of rocks, a locket, tarnished and rusted, with initials etched on its surface. The air around me grew heavy, and the whispers turned into a deafening roar. The ghostly figures surrounded me, their faces twisted with anguish. I held up the locket and shouted, "I'm here to help. Take it." The figures froze, their eyes locked on the locket. Slowly, they began to fade, their outlines dissolving into the night. The canyon fell silent. I left Echo Canyon at first light, the locket still clutched in my hand. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw a faint figure standing on the ridge watching me. At home, I wrote the story, but I kept the journal and locket hidden away. Sometimes, late at night, I hear footsteps outside my apartment, and when I close my eyes, I can still hear the echoes. My name is Riley Carter, and I'm 31 years old. What I'm about to share happened just a few weeks ago when I was camping alone in Blackstar Canyon, California. I'm a freelance travel writer, and for my blog, I often explore so-called haunted places to uncover the truth behind the legends. I'd always believed there was a rational explanation for the stories. That changed after Blackstar Canyon. It was a quiet Friday afternoon when I parked my RV at the edge of a disused trailhead. The drive had been uneventful, though the winding road up to the canyon had a foreboding quality I couldn't shake. The ranger station was a few miles away, but I'd passed no other campers. Just me and the wilderness. Blackstar Canyon had a reputation. Ghost stories, mysterious lights, and the tale of a witch burned alive by settlers in the 1800s. Supposedly, her spirit cursed the land, making it dangerous for those who dared to wander too far. It all sounded like the kind of exaggerated folklore my readers loved. I was there to experience the place firsthand, write a compelling story, and prove that the legends were nothing more than campfire tales. After setting up camp, I went for a short hike to stretch my legs. The trail was overgrown, as if nature was reclaiming the path. The air was unusually still, the kind of silence that presses on your ears. Every crunch of gravel under my boots felt deafening. When I returned to the RV, the sun was setting, casting the canyon in a golden light. I made a quick dinner, jotted down some notes, and settled in for the night. That's when I first heard it. A low humming sound, faint but deliberate. I froze, listening. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't an animal. It was rhythmic, almost like chanting. I stepped outside with my flashlight, scanning the darkening landscape. Nothing, just the whisper of the wind through the dry brush. Shaking it off, I went back inside, but the sound lingered in my mind long after I'd locked the door. The next morning, I decided to explore the area more thoroughly. I followed an unmarked trail that led deeper into the canyon. The farther I went, the more unsettling it became. The trees grew denser, their gnarled branches twisting like skeletal fingers. The air grew cooler, a strange contrast to the sun overhead. That's when I saw the first symbol. It was carved into the bark of a tree, an intricate pattern of spirals and jagged lines. It looked old, the grooves weathered by time, but there was something deliberate about it, as if it held meaning. I found more symbols as I walked, on rocks etched into the dirt. They formed a path, guiding me farther into the wilderness. I took pictures for my blog, my unease growing with each step. When I reached a clearing, the air seemed to shift. It was heavier, colder. I turned back, deciding I'd gone far enough for one day. By late afternoon, a thick fog rolled into the canyon, so dense I could barely see a few feet ahead. It wasn't normal. The forecast had been clear, and yet here I was, enveloped in an otherworldly mist. I stayed in the RV, the fog pressing against the windows like a living thing. That's when the humming returned, louder this time, almost inside my head. I tried to distract myself by editing photos, but my laptop's battery died inexplicably, followed by the lights flickering out. When I stepped outside to check the generator, I felt it, a presence. The fog was so thick I could hardly see my hands, but I knew I wasn't alone. My heart pounded as I hurried back inside, locking the door behind me. That night, I dreamed of fire. I saw a woman standing in the flames, her face obscured by shadows. She was screaming, though her voice sounded like the humming I'd heard. Around her were figures, men with torches and hateful expressions. I woke up gasping, drenched in sweat. My head ached and my vision blurred as I sat up. The humming was louder now, vibrating through the walls of the RV. I stepped outside, drawn toward the sound despite my fear. In the fog, I saw her. She was barely more than a shadow, her form flickering like a candle. Her eyes were hollow, glowing faintly. She raised a hand toward me, and I felt a wave of nausea, as if the air itself were pressing against my chest. I stumbled back inside, slamming the door shut. The next morning, I found it. A small, leather-bound book tucked into a crevice near the trail. The pages were brittle with age, filled with handwritten entries. It belonged to a settler named Margaret Wells, who had lived in the canyon in the mid-1800s. The entries told a horrifying story. Margaret wrote of a woman accused of witchcraft by the settlers. They believed she had cursed their crops and livestock, and in their fear, they burned her at the stake. Her final words were a curse, calling forth vengeance on anyone who dared to trespass on her land. Margaret's last entry warned of the witch's spirit, describing her as a shadow that lured people into the canyon and claimed them. To appease her, Margaret wrote, an offering must be made at her altar. That evening, as the fog thickened once more, I knew I had to find the altar. The diary's warnings felt like my only chance to escape. I packed a flashlight, the diary, and my locket, a silver pendant my mother had given me before she passed. It was the only personal item I had that felt meaningful enough to serve as an offering. The symbols guided me through the fog, their strange patterns almost glowing in the dim light. The path ended at a stone slab surrounded by withered trees. The air here was suffocating, heavy with the smell of burning wood. The shadow appeared again, more solid this time. The witch's form loomed over the altar, her hollow eyes locked on me. She didn't speak, but her presence was enough to freeze me in place. I placed the diary and locket on the altar, my hands trembling. "Please," I whispered, "I'm sorry for disturbing your land." For a moment, nothing happened. Then the humming stopped. The witch tilted her head as if considering me before dissolving into the fog. I didn't wait to see if she would return. I ran back to the RV, every step feeling like a lifetime. When I reached the vehicle, the power was back, the lights steady. I started the engine and drove, the fog lifting as I left the canyon. I haven't gone camping since. The scratches on my arms, ones I didn't notice until later, haven't healed properly, leaving faint scars. And sometimes, late at night, I hear the humming again. Blackstar Canyon changed me. It made me realize that some stories aren't meant to be uncovered, and some spirits should be left undisturbed. My name is Nora Ellis, and I'm 29 years old. I've always been independent. Too much, maybe. Being a travel nurse means I'm constantly on the move, used to taking care of others but never really stopping to take care of myself. A few weeks ago, I decided to change that. I took some time off and drove my RV up to the Lost Coast Trail in Northern California. I thought I'd find peace there, a way to clear my mind after a particularly rough year. I was wrong. The trail was famous for its rugged beauty. Towering cliffs, black sand beaches, and an endless expanse of ocean that stretched to the horizon. It was also infamous for its danger. The tides were unpredictable, and the terrain was unforgiving. But I wasn't planning to hike the whole thing. Just a few miles each day, enough to soak in the scenery and reset my mind. I parked my RV at a quiet trailhead, far from the more popular spots. It was perfect. No crowds, no noise. Just me and the wilderness. But even as I set up camp, a strange feeling settled in the pit of my stomach. The air was heavy, like it was waiting for something. That first night I lay in bed, listening to the waves crash against the cliffs. It should have been soothing, but the rhythm felt off, like a heartbeat that skipped. Around midnight I heard it for the first time. Faint crying, carried on the wind. I sat up, my pulse quickening. It sounded like a woman, distant but clear, sobbing in the dark. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside. The beam of light cut through the fog rolling in from the ocean. "Hello?" I called, my voice barely louder than the waves. No response. The crying stopped. I stood there for a few minutes, scanning the trees and the cliffs, but I didn't see anyone. Eventually, I went back inside, convincing myself it was just the wind playing tricks on me. The next morning, I set out on a section of the trail that hugged the cliffs. The scenery was breathtaking. Waves crashing against jagged rocks, sea foam spraying into the air. But as I walked, I noticed something odd. Puddles of salt water dotted the trail, far from where the tide could have reached. They were small and perfectly round, as if someone had been crying giant tears. I shook it off, telling myself it didn't matter. But a mile later, I found the shoes. They were old, tattered children's shoes, half buried in the sand. The leather was cracked, the soles worn down to nothing. My heart twisted as I stared at them. I thought of a little girl I couldn't save last year, a patient who had clung to me in her final moments, her tiny hand slipping from mine. I pushed the memory away and kept walking, but the farther I went, the heavier the air became. It was suffocating, pressing down on me with each step. That evening, the crying returned. I was sitting by the fire staring into the flames when I heard it again. Closer this time. A soft, mournful wail, carried on the wind. It raised the hairs on the back of my neck. I stood, my body tense. "Who's there?" I called. No answer. Then a voice, barely above a whisper. "Nora." My blood ran cold. It was a child's voice, fragile and trembling, calling my name. I grabbed my flashlight and scanned the darkness. The beam caught movement, something small darting between the trees. My heart leapt. "Hello?" I called again, my voice shaking. "Is someone out there?" I followed the movement, my boots crunching against the gravel. When I reached the edge of the trees, I saw her, a small figure standing at the cliff's edge. A child, no older than 6, her back to me. Her hair was damp, clinging to her face and shoulders. "Hey," I said, stepping closer, "are you lost? Are you hurt?" She turned slowly, and my stomach dropped. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow. Salt water dripped from her hair and dress, pooling at her bare feet. "You left me," she said, her voice cracking. I stumbled backward, my heart hammering in my chest. No, I didn't." Her form flickered, like a reflection on water, and then she was gone. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face, heard her voice. The guilt I'd buried for months resurfaced, clawing its way into my chest. I'd been trying to escape it, to leave it behind on this trip, but it was everywhere now. The next day, I found my hiking boots soaked with salt water. My backpack had been moved, its contents scattered around the campsite. At first, I thought it was an animal, but nothing was missing, just wet, as if it had been dunked in the ocean. And then there were the dreams. I dreamed of drowning. Cold hands pulled me under the waves, dragging me into the dark. I thrashed, gasping for air, but the water filled my lungs. When I woke, I could still feel the phantom pressure on my chest, the taste of salt on my tongue. I knew I had to leave, but when I tried to start the RV, the engine sputtered and died. My phone had no signal. I was trapped. Desperate for answers, I decided to hike a different part of the trail, hoping to clear my mind. That's when I found the journal. It was tucked into the rocks near a small cave, its leather cover weathered by time. The pages were fragile, the writing faded, but I could still make out the story. It belonged to a settler from the early 1900s who had lived near the Lost Coast. The entries described a woman who had lost her children to the violent tides. In her grief, she had thrown herself into the sea. But her spirit remained, searching for her lost children. The locals called her the Weeping Woman, and they said she lured travelers off the trail, leading them to their deaths. The journal warned, she takes those who remind her of what she lost, those who carry guilt. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I heard her again. The crying, the voice. It was closer now, almost inside my head. I grabbed the journal and followed the sound, my legs trembling with every step. She stood at the cliff's edge, her form more solid than before. Her dress clung to her, soaked and tattered, and her pale face glistened with tears. "Nora," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Help me." I clutched the journal, my knuckles white. "You're not real," I said, my voice shaking. "You're not her." Her head snapped toward me, her hollow eyes locking onto mine. "You left me," she said, stepping closer. "You let me drown." "No," I said, tears streaming down my face. I tried to save her." Her form flickered, the crying turning into a wail that pierced my ears. The wind whipped around us, salt water spraying into my face. My chest tightened, the weight of her grief pressing down on me. "You have to let go," I said, my voice cracking. "They're gone. Your children are gone, and nothing you do will bring them back." She froze, her form wavering. For a moment, I thought I saw relief in her hollow eyes. Then, with a final scream, she dissolved into the wind, her cries fading into silence. The air felt lighter as I made my way back to the RV. The oppressive weight was gone, replaced by a strange calm. When I tried the engine, it roared to life on the first try, but as I opened the door, I stopped. There, placed neatly by the step, were the tattered children's shoes I'd found on the trail. I picked them up, the leather cold and damp, and placed them on the passenger seat. Some things can't be forgotten. Some wounds never fully heal. But as I drove away from the lost coast, I felt something I hadn't in months. Peace. My name is Julian Harper, and I'm 35 years old. I used to think of myself as a rational person, someone who relied on facts and logic to navigate life. But what happened to me last month at Devil's Postpile National Monument changed that. It made me question everything I thought I understood about the world. I arrived at the park on a Friday afternoon. The drive had been long but scenic, winding through the rugged beauty of California's eastern Sierra Nevada. My plan was simple: spend 3 days photographing the basalt columns at Devil's Postpile and use the trip to clear my head. After my divorce 6 months ago, I'd been trying to find solace in the outdoors, hoping the solitude would help me piece my life back together. The parking lot near the main trailhead was packed, so I took a lesser-known turnoff and found a secluded area to park my RV. A ranger I'd spoken to earlier had mentioned this spot was rarely used. Perfect. I wanted quiet, away from the crowds and noise. That's what I told myself anyway. The truth was, I didn't want anyone around while I sorted through the wreckage of my life. That night, as I sat by the fire reviewing my camera footage, I noticed how eerily still the forest was. No rustling leaves, no chirping crickets, just silence. At first, I welcomed it. After years of city living, quiet felt like a luxury. But as the hours dragged on, the stillness started to weigh on me, like the trees were holding their breath. Around midnight, I turned in for the night. As I lay in the narrow RV bed, I thought I heard footsteps outside. Slow, deliberate. I froze, listening. My mind raced. A bear, another camper. But when I looked out the window, I saw nothing. Just darkness. The footsteps stopped. I told myself it was my imagination and forced myself to sleep. The next morning, I set out early, eager to explore the basalt columns. The air was crisp, the kind of cool that bites your skin but wakes you up. The formations were stunning, towering hexagonal columns that looked like they'd been chiseled by a divine hand. I spent hours capturing angles, waiting for the light to shift, lost in my work. That's when I saw it. A tall, dark figure stood on the far edge of the clearing, motionless. At first, I thought it was another hiker, but something about its shape felt wrong. Too tall, too thin. I raised my camera to zoom in, but when I looked through the lens, the figure was gone. I scanned the area, my chest tight, but there was nothing there. I told myself it was a trick of the light, shadows playing games. But deep down, I didn't believe it. By the time I returned to the RV, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the forest floor. I noticed something odd as I approached the vehicle. Footprints. They led away from the RV, deep impressions in the dirt. But as I examined them closer, my stomach dropped. The footprints weren't normal, they were inverted, as if something had risen out of the ground rather than stepping into it. I backed away, my heart pounding. Rational explanations tumbled through my mind. Animal tracks, weathered impressions, anything to keep me from acknowledging the growing unease in my chest. That night, I couldn't sleep. The silence was louder than ever, and the air inside the RV felt stifling. Around 3 a.m., I heard knocking at the door. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. I froze, adrenaline surging through me. "Who's there?" I called, trying to keep my voice steady. No response. I grabbed my flashlight and opened the door, my heart hammering in my chest. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but empty forest. I stepped outside, scanning the trees, my breath visible in the cold air. "Julian." The voice was soft, almost a whisper, but unmistakable. It was Laura's voice, my ex-wife. I spun around, my flashlight trembling. "Laura?" I called, panic creeping into my voice. There was no answer, just the rustling of leaves. The next day, I tried to shake it off. Exhaustion, stress, and guilt could mess with anyone's mind, right? That's what I told myself as I hiked to a new vantage point to photograph the columns. But the forest didn't feel the same. The air was heavy, oppressive. The paths seemed to shift beneath my feet, leading me in circles. And then I saw her. Laura stood at the edge of a clearing, her blonde hair falling over her shoulders just like I remembered. She wore the dress she had on the day we signed the divorce papers. She was crying. "Julian," she said, her voice breaking, "why did you leave me?" I stumbled backward, my legs shaking. "You're not real," I whispered. "You're not here." She stepped closer, her face pale and tear-streaked. "You left me behind." I turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush. Her voice followed me, growing louder, angrier. "You left me!" she screamed, the words echoing through the trees. When I finally made it back to the RV, I locked the door and sank to the floor, my chest heaving. That's when I noticed the journal. It sat on the small counter, its leather cover cracked with age. I hadn't brought it with me. My hands shook as I opened it. The entries belonged to a miner from the 1800s. He wrote of a devil that haunted the land, claiming the souls of those who wandered too far. The settlers had summoned it in a ritual for wealth, but had been tricked. The entity remained bound to the land, preying on trespassers. The miner described how the devil used guilt and regret to break its victims, appearing as loved ones or memories. He also described a ritual to ward it off, an iron barrier and an incantation tied to the land's original inhabitants. I knew I had to confront it. Waiting in the RV would only delay the inevitable. Gathering what I could, a camping pot for iron, a flashlight, and the journal, I made my way back to the basalt columns. The forest seemed alive now, the trees whispering, the shadows moving. At the columns, the devil appeared, this time fully formed. It was tall and black as night, its body shifting like smoke. Its face, if you could call it that, morphed between Laura's and something grotesque. Eyes too large, mouth too wide. "You can't run from me," it said, its voice a chorus of Laura's anger and my own inner doubt. "You left her. You let her suffer." "I know," I said, my voice trembling. "I know I failed her, but I won't fail myself." I placed the iron pot between us and recited the incantation from the journal. The words felt foreign on my tongue, but the air around me seemed to shift. The devil shrieked, its form twisting and shrinking. The ground beneath it cracked, and with one final guttural scream, it vanished. I drove away that night, not stopping until I was miles from the park. I haven't spoken about what happened until now. The photos from that trip are still on my camera, untouched. And sometimes, late at night, I think I hear Laura's voice in the wind. Some things aren't meant to be explored, and some places are better left behind. My name is Caleb Hunt, and I'm 42 years old. A few weeks ago, I packed up my RV and headed to Lake Shasta in Northern California. I'm a former Navy diver turned outdoor guide, and after retiring from a demanding career, I thought I'd spend my time exploring the places I'd never gotten around to visiting. This trip wasn't supposed to be anything unusual, just me, my gear, and the underwater caves I'd heard about near the lake. But what I found there, what found me there, changed everything. I arrived on a cool Thursday morning. The lake shimmered under a hazy sky, its surface so still it looked like glass. The northern shore was quiet, far from the marinas and tourists on the other side. Perfect for diving and even better for clearing my head. I'd been searching for clarity, for some kind of peace. After leaving the Navy, I'd been carrying more baggage than I wanted to admit. I parked my RV in a secluded spot near a cove and unloaded my kayak and diving gear. The air was crisp, and the water lapped gently against the shore. It should have been peaceful, but something about the place felt off. The quiet was too absolute, like the world was holding its breath. By mid-morning, I was in my wetsuit, paddling out toward the caverns I'd marked on my map. The lake was stunning from the surface, but the real treasure was beneath. The caverns were rumored to be intricate and vast, perfect for the kind of underwater exploration I craved. When I reached the spot, I anchored my kayak and descended. The water was colder than I'd expected, biting through my wetsuit. The sunlight filtered down in fractured beams, illuminating the cavern entrance. It was wide and dark, its edges jagged like teeth. As I moved inside, the world around me grew still. My breathing, amplified by my regulator, was the only sound. I swept my flashlight across the walls, noticing strange patterns in the sediment. They weren't natural. They looked deliberate, like crude carvings, circles, lines, symbols I didn't recognize. That's when I heard it. A low, mournful moaning. It reverberated through the water, faint but unmistakable. At first I thought it was the current or an echo from the surface, but it grew louder, more deliberate. It wasn't mechanical, it sounded human. I turned toward the sound, my flashlight cutting through the gloom, but there was nothing there. My chest tightened. I was a seasoned diver, trained to stay calm under pressure, but something about that sound gnawed at me. I finished my dive quickly and surfaced, my breath coming fast. Back at the RV, I couldn't shake the unease. I told myself it was nothing, probably some natural phenomenon amplified by the acoustics of the cavern. But as night fell, the quiet around the lake deepened. No birds, no wind, just silence. I was lying in bed staring at the ceiling when I heard it again. That same low moaning, but this time it wasn't underwater. It was outside. I froze, my pulse quickening. It sounded like it was coming from the shore, faint but insistent. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out into the cool night air. The beam swept across the water, the rocks, the trees. Nothing. Then I saw them. Two figures, pale and blurred, standing knee-deep in the water. My flashlight flickered and they were gone. The next morning, I tried to shake it off. Lack of sleep and overactive imagination, I told myself. But when I went to the shore to prepare for another dive, I found something that made my stomach drop. A gold coin, partially buried in the sand. It was perfectly preserved, its edges sharp, its surface gleaming. I picked it up, turning it over in my hand. The markings were strange, not like anything I'd seen before. I pocketed the coin and pushed off in my kayak. The cavern was waiting. This time, the water felt heavier, the pressure building as I descended. My gear, which had been fine the day before, started acting up. The flashlight flickered and my regulator hissed unevenly. I tried to stay calm, forcing my breathing to slow. As I moved deeper into the cavern, the moaning returned, louder than before. It seemed to come from everywhere, wrapping around me like a current. My flashlight swept across the walls, and that's when I saw it. A pale, floating figure, its eyes glowing faintly. It hung motionless in the water, watching me. I froze. Every instinct screamed at me to surface, but I couldn't look away. The figure's mouth opened and bubbles rose, carrying faint whispers I couldn't make out. Then it lunged. I kicked hard, propelling myself backward, and the figure disappeared into the darkness. My heart pounded as I ascended, my chest burning by the time I broke the surface. Back at the RV, I couldn't shake the image of the figure. It had felt real, tangible, not like the tricks of light I'd encountered before. That night, the whispers came again, this time louder, clearer. They weren't just moans. They were words. "Come back!" I bolted upright, sweat slick on my skin. The whispers didn't stop. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, scanning the lake. The water was unnaturally still, reflecting the moonlight like a mirror. And then I saw him. Michael, my best friend from the Navy, standing on the water, his uniform drenched, his eyes wide and accusing. "You left me," he said, his voice hollow. My chest tightened. "No, you were—" My words caught in my throat. He had died years ago, drowned during a mission we'd been on together. I'd tried to save him, but the current had been too strong. "You left me," he repeated, his voice cracking. "Why didn't you save me?" I stumbled back inside, slamming the door. The next day, desperate for answers, I returned to the shore and searched the area near the cavern. That's when I found it. An old leather-bound journal, half buried in the sand. The pages were damp, the ink faded, but I could still make out the words. The journal belonged to a settler from the Gold Rush era. It described a small town that had once stood where the lake now was. When the Shasta Dam was built, the town was flooded, its people forced to leave, or stay behind. The settlers who refused to leave had perished, their bodies claimed by the rising water. The journal claimed their spirits remained, bound to the lake, luring the living to join them. I knew I couldn't leave without facing them. The whispers, the visions, they wouldn't stop. I loaded my gear and paddled out to the cavern one last time, bringing the gold coin and a few other trinkets I'd found along the shore as an offering. The descent was colder, darker than before. The moaning started as soon as I entered the cavern, rising in intensity with every stroke of my fins. The water grew murky, shadows swirling around me. Then they appeared. Dozens of pale figures, their eyes glowing, their mouths moving silently. They surrounded me, reaching out with skeletal hands. One of them was Michael. "You can't leave," he whispered, his voice cutting through the water. "Stay with us." I held up the coin, the trinkets, and released them into the water. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice cracking. "I'm sorry for everything." The figures hesitated, their forms flickering. Michael reached for me, his hand stopping inches from my face before he dissolved into the dark. One by one, the others vanished, leaving only silence. I surfaced, gasping, the morning light cutting through the mist. The lake was still, but it no longer felt oppressive. Back at the RV, I found something waiting for me. Michael's dog tags lying on the counter. I hadn't seen them in years. Some things can't be explained, some things can't be undone. But as I drove away from Lake Shasta, I felt lighter, as if I'd left a part of my guilt behind in those dark waters. My name is Matthew Carter. I'm 43 years old, and I make my living traveling the country in an RV, blogging about local legends and folklore. It's not glamorous, but it pays the bills and feeds my obsession with uncovering the truth behind ghost stories and superstitions. Most of the time, I find nothing more than exaggerated tales and overactive imaginations. But last spring, I came face to face with something I still can't explain. This happened in the Elfin Forest Recreational Reserve in Escondido, California. I was drawn to the area by stories of a supposed curse in a place locals called Devil's Hollow. The legend was typical fare: a healer accused of witchcraft by Spanish settlers, executed unjustly, her spirit cursing the land. The stories spoke of strange storms, shadowy figures, and whispered voices. I'd heard variations of the tale before, but the vivid accounts piqued my interest. Plus, the reserve's twisted oaks and rugged trails seemed like the perfect backdrop for some striking photos to accompany my blog post. I arrived at the reserve on a warm Friday afternoon. The sky a brilliant blue, and the air carrying the faint smell of sagebrush. The park was quiet, with only a handful of cars in the lot. After paying my fee at the entrance booth, I parked my RV at the edge of the reserve, where the woods grew thick and the trails began to wind away from civilization. As I unloaded my gear, a young couple approached me. They were in their late 20s, dressed in hiking boots and bright, moisture-wicking clothes. The guy, tall and wiry with a patchy beard, spoke first. "You're heading into the hollow, aren't you?" I smiled, not wanting to sound dismissive. "That's the plan. Heard some interesting stories about it." The woman, petite with sharp eyes, frowned. "You shouldn't go there. People don't come back the same." "Thanks for the warning," I said, brushing off their concern. I'd heard variations of this warning in almost every town I'd visited. The man sighed, shaking his head. "It's not just the stories. You'll feel it. The air's wrong in there. If you do go, just don't stay after dark." Ignoring their advice, I set off with my camera and notebook, eager to explore. The woods were stunning. Gnarled oaks stretched overhead, their branches intertwining to form natural arches. Shadows danced along the trails, creating a kaleidoscope of light and dark. As I moved deeper into the forest, the noise of the outside world faded, replaced by the rustle of leaves and the occasional call of a bird. Hours passed without incident, but something strange happened as I approached the heart of the reserve. My watch stopped. The second hand froze at 3:27, and no amount of tapping would start it again. Annoyed, I pulled out my phone, only to find the clock there had reset to midnight. "Must be the signal out here," I muttered, though it didn't explain the dead watch. The deeper I ventured, the more disoriented I felt. Trails that should have looped back toward the parking area instead seemed to lead me in circles. Several times I passed the same boulder covered in moss, its shape unmistakable. I marked a nearby tree with my pocket knife and continued walking, only to find myself back at the same spot 20 minutes later. By the time I returned to the RV, the sun was already sinking behind the hills, casting the forest in long, jagged shadows. Frustrated and tired, I made a quick dinner and settled in to review my notes. That's when the power began to flicker. At first, it was just the lights, brief, annoying surges that I attributed to a loose connection. But then my laptop shut down, even though it was plugged in, and the microwave beeped erratically as if short-circuiting. I went outside to check the generator, only to find it in perfect working order. A sense of unease settled over me, but I brushed it off. Equipment fails. It's nothing supernatural. As night fell, the whispers began. At first, they were faint, barely audible over the rustling trees. But as I sat in my RV, scribbling notes, the sound grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't the wind. The whispers had a cadence, a rhythm, like words spoken in a language I couldn't understand. Grabbing a flashlight, I stepped outside, determined to find the source. The forest was unnaturally quiet. No crickets, no birds, just the whispers, coming from deeper within the woods. The light from my flashlight barely pierced the thick darkness, and every step felt like I was being watched. Then I saw them. Symbols carved into the trees around my RV. They were crude, jagged shapes, some resembling eyes, others spirals. A chill ran down my spine. Those hadn't been there earlier. The whispers grew louder as a storm rolled in out of nowhere. The wind howled, rain lashed against the RV, and lightning illuminated the twisted trees. As I scrambled back inside, I caught a glimpse of something, or someone, standing just beyond the tree line. A shadowy figure, too still to be human, watching me. When the next flash of lightning came, it was gone. Sleep was impossible. The storm raged, and the whispers continued, now interspersed with what sounded like sobbing. I tried to tell myself it was just the wind, but deep down, I knew better. Just past midnight, the sobbing turned into laughter. It was a woman's voice, high-pitched and mocking, coming from directly outside the RV. My hands trembled as I locked the doors and pulled the curtains tight, but the laughter persisted, growing louder, closer. Then, on the windshield, words appeared, written in what looked like blood. "Leave now." I wanted to. Every instinct screamed at me to start the engine and drive, but my pride wouldn't let me. I needed to know what was happening, to prove to myself that it wasn't real. Grabbing my flashlight and a small pocket knife, I stepped outside into the storm. The wind nearly knocked me off my feet as I stumbled toward the edge of the woods. The laughter stopped, replaced by silence so oppressive I could hear my own heartbeat. My flashlight flickered, and then I saw her. The Witch of Elfin Hollow stood beneath an ancient oak, her form barely visible through the rain. She was tall, her hair billowing like smoke, her eyes glowing an unnatural green. Her mouth moved, but I couldn't hear the words over the roar of the wind. "Who are you?" I shouted, my voice trembling. Her lips twisted into a smile, and she raised a hand, pointing to something behind me. Turning, I saw the stone altar. It hadn't been there earlier. The altar was covered in remnants of burnt offerings, charred bones, melted candles, and dried herbs. As I approached, the whispers returned, now deafening, and the wind whipped around me in a frenzy. I reached out to touch the stones, and the moment my fingers brushed them, the storm ceased. The silence was worse than the noise. The witch appeared again, standing directly in front of me. Her face was skeletal, her eyes burning with fury. She spoke one word, her voice reverberating in my chest. "Leave!" I stumbled backward, tripping over the altar as she advanced. Her hands reached for me, skeletal fingers stretching unnaturally long. Desperate, I fumbled for my knife and slashed at the air. She recoiled, shrieking, and I used the moment to run. Back in the RV, I started the engine and sped away, not caring about the mud or the narrow trails. The witch's figure loomed in the rearview mirror, her glowing eyes the last thing I saw before she vanished. I didn't stop driving until I reached a motel an hour away. Even then, I couldn't sleep. My hands shook as I typed up my notes, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. The photos I'd taken were mostly normal, but one stood out. A blurry figure standing by the altar, its eyes glowing green. I haven't been back to Elfin Forest, and I don't plan to. The Witch of Elfin Hollow is no mere legend. She's real, and her warning is one I'll never forget. Some places are cursed, and no amount of skepticism can protect you from what lies within. My name is Jessica Lane, but most people call me Jess. I'm 29 years old, an amateur filmmaker and a self-proclaimed adrenaline junkie when it comes to haunted places and urban legends. Last spring, I decided to film a documentary about haunted campgrounds, something to spice up my small but loyal YouTube channel. What happened in the Angeles National Forest during that trip still haunts me, and I'm not sure if I'll ever look at the world the same way again. This story takes place near the Chilao campground, in a remote part of the forest. It's known for its quiet beauty, twisted oaks, rugged hills, but also for the legend of the lost choir. According to local lore, decades ago, a fire destroyed a church camp in the area, killing all the children who were trapped inside the chapel. People say their voices can still be heard singing at night, luring the living into the woods. Naturally, I had to see for myself. I arrived on a Friday afternoon in my RV, eager to start filming. The campground was nearly empty, which wasn't unusual for the off-season, but it added an eerie quiet to the place. The twisted trees looked like they were frozen in motion, their branches reaching toward each other like gnarled fingers. A small wooden sign marked the start of the trails, its paint faded and peeling. As I parked my RV and began unloading my gear, I was approached by a park ranger. He looked to be in his late 50s, with weathered skin and a no-nonsense demeanor. His name tag read Ranger Evans. "You camping out here alone?" he asked, his voice tinged with concern. "Yep, just for the weekend," I replied, trying to sound casual. "I'm working on a documentary about haunted places." Evans frowned. "You're not here because of the lost choir, are you?" I nodded, my excitement clear. "Exactly. I read about it online and thought it'd make a great story, any truth to the legend." The ranger's frown deepened. "Some stories are better left alone. People hear things out here, voices, singing. It's not just campfire tales. Be careful, and don't go wandering off after dark." I thanked him for the advice, but inside I dismissed it as local folklore meant to scare off tourists. I've heard dozens of stories like this before, and none of them had ever turned out to be true. The first day passed uneventfully. I spent hours hiking and filming, capturing footage of the twisted trees and the expansive views of the San Gabriel Mountains. As the sun began to set, I set up a small campfire and started reviewing the footage on my laptop. That's when I first heard it, a faint melody drifting through the trees. At first, I thought it was my imagination or maybe the wind. But as I listened, the sound became clearer. Children's voices, singing in perfect harmony. The melody was soft and haunting, unlike anything I'd ever heard. I grabbed my audio recorder and stepped outside, my heart pounding with both excitement and unease. The singing seemed to be coming from deeper in the woods. I followed it for a short distance, but the farther I went, the more disoriented I felt. The air grew colder, and the light from my flashlight barely seemed to penetrate the thick darkness. Eventually, I decided to turn back, promising myself I'd investigate further in the morning. The next day, I reviewed my recordings. The singing was faint but audible, clear enough to make the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Encouraged, I decided to follow the trail further, hoping to find the source. As I hiked, I noticed strange carvings in the trees, symbols I didn't recognize, etched deep into the bark. They looked like spirals, eyes, and other shapes that defied explanation. Around midday, I stumbled upon the ruins of an old chapel. The structure was barely standing, its roof collapsed, and its walls blackened by fire. Inside, I found melted hymn books, rusted candelabras, and scattered children's shoes, their soles warped from the heat. The sight was deeply unsettling, but it was exactly what I needed for my documentary. As I filmed the chapel, the air around me grew heavy, and the singing returned. It was louder now, echoing off the charred walls. I spun around, trying to pinpoint the source, but the sound seemed to come from everywhere at once. Then I saw them. Shadowy figures of children standing among the trees, watching me. "Who's there?" I called, my voice trembling. The figures didn't move, but the singing grew louder. Panic set in, and I bolted from the chapel, tripping over roots and rocks as I raced back to my RV. That night, the atmosphere grew even darker. As I sat in the RV, trying to convince myself that I hadn't really seen anything, the singing returned, this time accompanied by faint laughter. I locked the doors and closed the curtains, but the sound persisted, growing louder and more insistent. Then I noticed something chilling. Small, muddy footprints tracked across the floor of the RV. They hadn't been there earlier, and I hadn't left the vehicle since returning from the chapel. My chest tightened, and I grabbed my flashlight, scanning every corner of the RV. It was empty, or at least it looked that way. A loud knock on the window made me jump. I spun around, shining my flashlight toward the sound, but there was nothing there. The knocking came again, this time from the door. My breath caught as I slowly approached, knife in hand. When I flung the door open, no one was there, but on the ground outside I saw more footprints leading away from the RV and into the woods. Against my better judgment, I decided to follow them. The singing had stopped, replaced by a deafening silence that made every crunch of leaves beneath my boots sound like an explosion. The footprints led me back to the chapel, where I found the shadowy figures waiting for me. This time, they were closer, their features slightly more defined. Pale faces, hollow eyes, and hands that seemed to melt into the darkness. "Help us," a voice whispered, breaking the silence. I froze. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice barely audible. Fragments of images flashed before my eyes. Children trapped in the chapel as flames consumed it, their screams drowned out by the sound of the fire. I understood then that their deaths hadn't been accidental. Someone had set the fire deliberately, though the reason remained unclear. Before I could process what I'd seen, a new presence emerged. A dark, towering figure stepped out of the shadows, its form shifting like smoke. Unlike the children, this entity radiated malice. Its glowing red eyes locked onto me, and it let out a low guttural growl. I turned and ran, the ground shifting beneath my feet as the air grew thick with smoke. The entity pursued me, its heavy footsteps echoing behind me. When I reached the RV, I slammed the door shut and fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely start the engine. As I sped down the narrow road, the singing faded, replaced by a high-pitched wail that seemed to follow me until I reached the main highway. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away, safe in a brightly lit gas station parking lot. In the days that followed, I reviewed my footage. Most of it was normal, but one clip sent chills down my spine, a shot of the chapel's interior, with the shadowy children standing in the doorway, their eyes glowing faintly. Behind them, the dark figure loomed, its red eyes burning like embers. I uploaded the video to my channel, but I didn't tell the whole story. Some things are better left unsaid. I haven't been back to the Angeles National Forest since, and I don't plan to. Whatever haunts that place is beyond my understanding, and I have no desire to disturb it again. My name is Ethan Grayson, and I was 36 when I came face to face with something I'll never fully understand. I had always considered myself a man of reason, someone who sought solace in the natural world and found beauty in its quiet simplicity. But what happened to me last year during a solo camping trip to Mendocino National Forest shattered my sense of reality. It started as an attempt to escape. I had lost my younger sister Amanda 6 months earlier in a car accident. Grief wrapped around me like a suffocating fog, and no amount of therapy or well-meaning advice could lift it. As a writer, I thought maybe a change of scenery could help. I packed my RV with notebooks, pens, and a few comforts from home, intending to work on a book about healing and loss. But instead of healing, I found something else entirely. I arrived at Lake Pillsbury on a bright spring afternoon. The air was crisp, and the lake shimmered under the sunlight. My campsite was tucked away near the tree line, offering a perfect view of the water and the surrounding hills. It felt peaceful, the kind of place where I thought I could finally breathe. The first 2 days were uneventful. I spent my mornings hiking the trails, my afternoons scribbling half-formed ideas in my notebook, and my evenings sitting by the fire, nursing a cup of coffee and staring into the flames. It wasn't productive, but at least the silence of the forest was better than the oppressive quiet of my apartment. Things started to change on the 3rd day. That morning, while exploring a narrow trail, I found an overgrown path leading up a steep hill. Something about it drew me in. It felt hidden, almost forbidden, like a secret the forest was keeping. At the top of the hill, I discovered a jagged cliff overlooking the lake. The view was breathtaking, but what caught my attention was the cave. It was small, partially obscured by vines with jagged rocks framing its entrance like teeth. I felt a strange pull toward it, a curiosity that bordered on compulsion, but as I stepped closer, a sudden chill ran through me. The air seemed heavier near the cave, and the birdsong that had accompanied me all morning had vanished. I shook off the feeling and made a mental note to return later with my camera. For now, I retreated to my RV, hoping to get some writing done. But as the day wore on, I couldn't shake the image of the cave. That night, the forest felt different. The air was colder, and the usual hum of insects seemed muted. As I sat by the fire, trying to focus on my notebook, I heard it. The cawing of a raven. It was faint at first, almost drowned out by the crackle of the flames, but it grew louder, closer. I glanced around, expecting to see the bird, but the treetops were empty. The sound persisted, its rhythm strange and uneven, almost like a chant. My chest tightened as unease crept over me. Eventually, the cawing stopped, leaving a silence that felt heavier than the noise. I convinced myself it was just a bird and went to bed, though sleep didn't come easily. The next day, I returned to the cave. I don't know why I felt so compelled to go back. Maybe it was the lack of sleep, or the way my grief had left me numb and searching for meaning in anything. As I approached, I noticed strange markings carved into the rocks around the entrance. They looked like spirals, eyes, and symbols I couldn't decipher. The air was colder than it had been the day before, and a faint, almost metallic smell lingered near the cave. I hesitated at the entrance, shining my flashlight into the darkness. The beam illuminated jagged walls and scattered debris. Bones, small and brittle, arranged in crude patterns. My stomach turned, but I couldn't look away. The deeper I moved into the cave, the heavier the air became, as if something was pressing down on me. Then I heard it, a whisper. At first, I thought it was the wind, but the sound formed words. My name. Ethan. I froze, my flashlight trembling in my hand. Who's there? I called, my voice echoing off the walls. The whisper came again, softer but unmistakable. "Ethan, help me!" It was Amanda's voice. I stumbled out of the cave, my breath ragged and my heart pounding. The rational part of my mind told me it couldn't be real, that my grief was playing tricks on me. But deep down, I felt something sinister, something watching me. Back at the RV, I tried to write about what I'd experienced, but my thoughts were scattered. My notebook pages tore as I pressed the pen too hard, and I found myself pacing, unable to sit still. That night, the cawing returned, louder than before, and this time it was accompanied by shadows. From the corner of my eye, I saw them. Dark shapes flickering just outside the windows, moving too quickly to focus on. When I stepped outside with my flashlight, the shadows vanished, but the feeling of being watched remained. I turned back to the RV and froze. Scratched into the dirt beside my campsite was a single word: leave. Despite the warnings, I couldn't let it go. I felt drawn to the cave, as if something inside it was calling me. The next morning, I packed my flashlight, my journal, and a small pocket knife before heading back. As I climbed the hill, a woman appeared on the trail. She was pale, her clothes torn, and her eyes wide with fear. "Don't go to the cave," she said, her voice trembling. "It'll take you just like it took me." Before I could respond, she turned and disappeared into the trees. Her warning echoed in my mind as I reached the cave, but I ignored it, stepping inside once more. The cave felt darker this time, the air heavier. The whispers returned, louder and more insistent. They weren't just Amanda's voice anymore. They were a chorus, overlapping and indistinct, pulling me deeper into the cave. My flashlight flickered, casting erratic shadows on the walls. Then I saw it. At the back of the cave stood a figure, a towering, raven-like entity with glowing red eyes and wings that seemed to absorb the light. Its face was human, twisted in agony, and its voice filled the air, a guttural growl that made my skin crawl. "You failed her," it said, the words slamming into me like a physical force. "You let her die." I fell to my knees, the weight of its presence crushing me. Images of Amanda flashed before my eyes. Her smile, her laugh. The last time I saw her before the accident. The entity stepped closer, its wings unfurling, and I felt my mind slipping, consumed by guilt and despair. But then I remembered my journal. Shaking, I pulled it from my bag and held it up like a shield. The words I had written about Amanda, my love for her, my grief, my memories, seemed to glow in the dim light. The entity recoiled, its form flickering like a dying flame. With the last of my strength, I stood and ran, the whispers and cawing fading as I burst out of the cave and into the sunlight. I didn't stop running until I reached the RV. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely start the engine. As I drove away, the forest seemed to close in around me, the shadows growing longer, the cawing of ravens echoing in the distance. I haven't been back to Mendocino National Forest since, and I don't plan to. Whatever lives in that cave is something I can't explain, something I don't want to face again. But I left with something I didn't expect, a sense of clarity. Confronting the darkness forced me to confront my grief, and though the memory of the raven's nest haunts me, it also reminds me of Amanda, and the love we shared that even death can't erase. My name is Daniel Reed, and I was 40 years old when I found the Devil's Mirror in the desolate beauty of Joshua Tree National Park. I didn't believe in legends or curses. I was a geologist, someone who valued facts over superstition. But what I experienced during that trip changed everything I thought I knew about the world and about myself. It was February when I drove my RV into the park, eager to escape the noise of the world. My divorce had been finalized a few months earlier, and my life felt as barren as the desert around me. I told myself this trip was about cataloging rock formations and taking photos for a side project, but deep down, I knew I was running from the mess of my life. The first few days were uneventful. I hiked the trails, admired the otherworldly shapes of the Joshua trees, and filled my notebook with observations about the park's unique geology. The solitude was exactly what I needed until I found the trail. It was on the fourth morning, while exploring a narrow canyon, that I noticed something odd. Carvings on a boulder near the path. Arrows, crudely etched, pointing toward a side trail I hadn't seen before. It wasn't marked on my map, and curiosity got the better of me. I followed the trail as it twisted through the canyon, the air growing cooler and stiller with each step. After an hour, I reached a clearing at the base of a cliff, and there it was. The Devil's Mirror. The slab of obsidian stood out against the pale sandstone like a black wound. It was taller than me, its surface unnaturally smooth and polished, reflecting the desert sky with perfect clarity. I'd seen obsidian before, but never anything like this. It felt out of place, too deliberate. Someone or something had shaped it. As I stepped closer, I caught my reflection in the mirror. Something about it made me uneasy. My image was crisp, but the way it moved didn't feel quite right. When I raised my hand, my reflection lagged, as if it were reluctant to follow. I chalked it up to my imagination and snapped a few photos before heading back to my RV. That night, the desert felt different. The wind carried a faint whisper, too rhythmic to be random. As I sat outside my RV, reviewing my notes, I realized the whisper was saying something. My name. Dan. I froze, listening intently, but the sound faded into the night. I laughed it off, probably the wind or an animal. But when I went inside, I noticed something strange. My camera, which I'd left on the table, had been moved. It now sat on the counter, pointing directly at the RV door. I hadn't touched it. I tried to shake the unease and went to bed. But my dreams were vivid and unsettling. Images of the mirror, my reflection moving on its own, and a voice whispering words I couldn't understand. The next morning, I woke with a pounding headache and an unshakable urge to return to the mirror. I told myself it was for research, that I wanted to get a closer look at the obsidian's formation. But deep down, I knew it was something more. The mirror had lodged itself in my mind, pulling at me like a magnet. As I approached the clearing, I felt the air grow heavier, as if the desert itself were holding its breath. When I reached the mirror, my reflection greeted me, but something was wrong. My face looked darker, my eyes hollow, and the faintest grin played at the corners of my reflection's mouth. I took a step back, my stomach twisting. Then it moved, not me, my reflection. It grinned fully, a wide, unnatural smile that didn't match the dread I felt. My heart raced as I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over a rock. The reflection raised its hand and waved, mocking me. I ran back to my RV, my chest tight with fear. Every rational part of me screamed that it couldn't be real, that I was exhausted or dehydrated. But when I reviewed the photos I'd taken of the mirror, I saw something that made my blood run cold. My reflection wasn't in the photos. That night, the whispers returned, louder this time. They weren't just calling my name anymore. They were repeating things my ex-wife had said during our worst arguments. "You're a failure, Dan. You're better off alone." I pressed my hands over my ears, but the whispers grew louder, overlapping into a cacophony. When I looked out the window, I saw it. My reflection, standing in the distance, staring at the RV. It tilted its head, the way a predator might size up its prey. The following day, I told myself I'd leave the park. But something held me back, an invisible chain dragging me toward the mirror. I had to face it to understand what was happening. I packed a flashlight, water, and my notebook before setting off toward the canyon. As I approached the mirror, a woman appeared on the trail. She wore a ranger's uniform, but her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. "Don't go back," she said, her voice trembling. "It'll take you like it took the others." "Who are you?" I asked. But she shook her head and vanished into the desert, leaving no footprints behind. When I reached the clearing, the air was suffocating. The mirror seemed to pulse with a faint, dark light, as if it were alive. My reflection was already there, grinning at me from the polished surface. This time, it stepped out. The figure that emerged was a grotesque distortion of me. Its eyes were black pits, its smile unnaturally wide, and its movements jerky like a puppet on strings. "You think you're better than this," it said, its voice a twisted echo of my own. "But you're just like me." It lunged at me, and I stumbled back, dropping my flashlight. The creature stood over me, its grin growing impossibly wider. "You can't escape who you are," it hissed. "You're nothing without your anger, your regret." Desperate, I grabbed a rock and swung it at the mirror. The obsidian cracked with a deafening sound, the shards scattering across the clearing. The creature let out a howl, its form flickering and distorting before vanishing into the night. I don't remember how I got back to my RV. My hands were bleeding, my head pounding, but the oppressive weight in the air was gone. As I drove away from the park, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw a glint of black among the rocks, the shards of the devil's mirror, still reflecting the empty desert. I haven't told anyone about what happened, and I've avoided mirrors ever since. Some part of me knows the mirror wasn't destroyed, not really. It's still out there, waiting for the next person to look too closely and see themselves as they truly are. My name is Samantha Reed, and I was 41 when this happened. If you've ever heard of Devil's Gate Reservoir in Pasadena, California, you probably know its reputation. Occult rituals, disappearances, whispers of the paranormal. I didn't believe in any of that. As a journalist, I built my career on uncovering the truth, and I thought this story would be just another urban legend to debunk. I couldn't have been more wrong. It was late October when I pulled up to the reservoir in my rented RV. The area was strangely quiet for a Saturday afternoon. Most of the trails had been abandoned for years, and the place had an eerie, desolate charm, perfect for the kind of atmospheric photos I wanted to include in my article. I parked near an overgrown trailhead and set up camp. The RV felt reassuring, a small bubble of safety amid the isolation. My first task was to meet with a local park ranger I'd contacted, a man named Harris. He arrived just before sunset, his face lined with the kind of weariness that comes from knowing too much. "You shouldn't stay here overnight," he said, skipping the pleasantries. "I appreciate the concern," I replied, turning on my recorder, "but I'm here to research. People love a good ghost story." "This isn't a ghost story," he said, his voice flat. "This place, it's wrong. People hear children laughing at night, they see things, shadows, handprints, and some of them don't come back." I nodded, jotting down his words. He was good for the angle I wanted, local myths and superstitions, but I could tell he was holding something back. "Have you seen anything yourself?" I asked. He hesitated, then glanced toward the reservoir. "I don't go near the water anymore." By the time he left, the sun was dipping below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. I made a simple dinner on my camping stove and settled into the RV, reviewing my notes. It started around midnight. I'd been lying in bed, drifting between wakefulness and sleep when I heard it. Laughter. It was faint, high-pitched, and unmistakably the sound of children playing. I sat up, my pulse quickening. Grabbing my flashlight, I stepped outside. The air was cold, the kind of chill that bites through your clothes. The laughter came again, this time from the direction of the reservoir. "Hello?" I called, shining the beam of light toward the water. The laughter stopped. I stood there for a moment, straining to hear anything else, but the only sound was the wind rustling through the trees. Finally, I went back inside, locking the RV door behind me. The next morning, I decided to explore the trail near the reservoir. The path was overgrown with weeds and littered with fallen branches, but I pressed on, snapping photos as I went. That's when I saw them. Hanging from the branches of a tree were dolls. Weathered and decayed, their faces cracked, their clothes discolored. Someone had tied them there with string, letting them sway gently in the breeze. I stepped closer, my breath catching in my throat. The dolls weren't arranged randomly, they formed a crude circle around the trunk. In the center of the circle, the bark was scorched, blackened as if by fire. I took a photo, then turned to leave. But as I walked away, I heard a soft creak, like the sound of a swing in motion. When I looked back, one of the dolls had turned, its empty eyes staring straight at me. I returned to the RV unsettled but determined to stay rational. Dolls tied to trees? Probably some kids trying to scare people. Laughter at night. The wind can play tricks on the mind. But the next encounter was harder to explain. That evening, as I was reviewing the photos on my laptop, the laughter came again. Only this time it was accompanied by something else. A voice, faint and pleading. "Help me." I froze. "Who's there?" I called, stepping outside. The voice came again, clearer now. "Help me, please." It was coming from the direction of the reservoir. Against every instinct screaming at me to stay put, I followed it, the flashlight shaking in my hand. Near the water's edge, I saw a figure. It was small, childlike, and crouched by the shore. "Hey!" I called, moving closer. The figure turned. It was a boy, no older than 7. His skin pale and his clothes drenched as if he'd just climbed out of the reservoir. But his eyes, they were hollow, dark pits that seemed to swallow the light. He opened his mouth to speak, but the sound that came out wasn't human. It was a low, guttural growl that sent a jolt of fear through me. I stumbled backward, nearly dropping the flashlight. When I looked up again, he was gone. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the boy's face. Around 3 a.m., I decided to review the audio recordings I'd made earlier in the day. At first, the file was just static, but then I heard it. Faint whispers layered beneath the noise. "She's here. She'll stay. She's ours." My stomach turned. The voice wasn't mine. The final straw came the next day. While hiking further into the woods, I stumbled upon an old playground. Rusted swings, a broken merry-go-round, all overgrown with moss. The air here was heavy, suffocating, and the whispers were louder than ever. As I stood there, trying to steady my breathing, I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. A shadow darted behind the merry-go-round, then another, and another. They were fast, too fast to be human. I turned to leave, but the ground beneath my feet shifted. Suddenly, I was standing in the reservoir, the water up to my ankles. I hadn't moved, hadn't taken a single step toward the water, but there I was, as if the forest itself had pushed me forward. That's when I saw them, the children, dozens of them, their shadowy forms rising from the water. They didn't speak, but their hollow eyes fixed on me, unblinking. A single figure emerged behind them, taller and darker than the rest. Its shape was humanoid but distorted, its limbs too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. "You'll stay," it said, its voice a chorus of whispers. you'll stay with us." I ran. I don't remember how I made it back to the RV, but when I did, the engine wouldn't start. Desperate, I grabbed my journal and reread my notes about the rituals performed at Devil's Gate in the 1940s. There were mentions of symbols, wards carved into rocks to seal the spirits. If I could destroy one, maybe it would break the connection. Armed with nothing but a pocket knife, I ran back to the trail. The whispers followed me, growing louder with every step. When I reached the scorched tree, I carved into the bark with frantic strokes, obliterating the symbols etched there. The moment I finished, the whispers stopped. The air grew still, and for the first time, I felt like I could breathe again. By the time I returned to the RV, the sun was rising. The engine roared to life on the first try, and I drove away without looking back. Later, when I reviewed my photos and audio, most of the evidence was gone. Blurry images, corrupted files. But one photo remained intact, the boy by the reservoir, his hollow eyes staring straight at the camera. Even now, I hear the whispers sometimes. They call my name, soft and insistent. And I know, one day, I might not be able to resist answering. My name is Aaron Mathis, and I was 34 when it happened. I've always thought of myself as curious, a seeker of hidden places and untold stories. As a travel blogger, I visited remote islands, climbed forgotten ruins, and hiked through dense forests. I loved peeling back the layers of mystery in a place, showing my audience what the guidebooks wouldn't. But what I found at Redwood Hollow in Jedediah Smith Redwood State Park wasn't the kind of mystery you solve. It was the kind that swallows you whole. It started with a whisper I'd overheard in an online travel forum, a post buried beneath threads about popular trails and scenic views. The writer claimed there was an unmarked spot deep in Jedediah Smith, a place called Redwood Hollow. They said it was cursed, that no one who ventured there came back the same. Others chimed in with wild stories. A glowing lantern that led hikers astray, whispers in the trees, and a feeling that the forest itself was alive and hungry. I was hooked. I parked my RV near the main entrance to the park, far from any other visitors. It was early October, and the mist clung to the redwoods like a veil, muffling every sound. I had my gear, a lightweight tent, food and water for 2 days, a compass, GPS, and my trusty camera. My plan was simple: find Redwood Hollow, document the truth, and turn the legend into a compelling blog post. The first day's hike was uneventful but eerie. The towering trees blocked most of the sunlight, casting long shadows even at noon. The forest was quiet, too quiet. I kept telling myself that's what I wanted. Solitude, peace, but the stillness began to gnaw at me. By late afternoon, I stumbled upon it. Redwood Hollow. It was a small clearing, perfectly round, surrounded by ancient redwoods so massive they seemed to lean inward, as if shielding the hollow from the rest of the world. At the center stood a tree with a weathered lantern hanging from one of its lower branches. The lantern was old, its metal rusted, its glass cracked. It swayed gently, though there wasn't a hint of wind. I set up my tent on the edge of the clearing, feeling the weight of the place settle on me. There was something off about the hollow, something I couldn't put into words. The air felt heavier here, the shadows deeper. That night, I woke to a sound, a faint creaking, like wood straining against itself. I sat up in my tent, my heart racing, and listened. It was coming from the lantern. Through the mesh of my tent, I could see it glowing faintly. I grabbed my camera and stepped outside, telling myself it had to be a reflection of the moonlight, or some natural phenomenon. But as I approached the lantern, the glow faded, leaving me standing in darkness. Just a trick of the light, I muttered, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The next morning, I discovered my compass was missing, along with a flashlight and part of my food rations. I searched my tent, my backpack, everywhere. Frustrated, I stepped outside and froze. The missing items were neatly arranged on a tree stump near the edge of the clearing. I hadn't put them there. Determined to brush it off as my own forgetfulness, I spent the day exploring the hollow. I wandered the trails that seemed to radiate out from the clearing, though none were marked. The forest felt disorienting, like it was shifting around me. Paths that seemed clear one moment were blocked by undergrowth the next. And then I found the journal. It was hidden beneath a pile of rocks, its cover damp and its pages warped. Inside were entries written in frantic, looping handwriting. They described another hiker who had camped here years ago. He'd followed the lantern into the forest, convinced it was leading him to safety. But the deeper he went, the louder the whispers became. The last entry read, "Do not trust the light. It will take everything." By dusk, I was exhausted. As the sky darkened, I saw the lantern glowing again, this time at the edge of the clearing. I told myself not to approach it, but curiosity clawed at me. I grabbed my camera and began filming, narrating for my audience. "The lantern appears to move," I said, my voice shaky. "It's faint, but you can see it glowing. This could be caused by bioluminescent algae or some kind of reflective material. I'm going to get closer." As I stepped toward it, the whispers began. They were faint at first, like the rustling of leaves, but soon they grew louder, insistent. "Follow the light," they said. I stopped, my stomach twisting. "Who's there?" I called. The whispers didn't answer. Instead, the lantern swayed, its glow pulsing, almost beckoning. Against my better judgment, I followed it. The lantern led me down a narrow, winding path that I hadn't seen before. The forest closed in around me, the trees pressing so close that their branches intertwined overhead, blocking out the stars. The whispers grew louder, overlapping, blending into an incomprehensible chorus. Follow, safety, light, deeper. I walked for what felt like hours, my flashlight flickering, my breath coming in short gasps. The path twisted and turned, and no matter how far I went, there was no sign of an end. Finally, I stumbled into a clearing. But it wasn't Redwood Hollow. At the center of this new clearing was another lantern, glowing brighter than before. Beneath it stood a figure cloaked in shadows. It was tall, impossibly tall, its limbs elongated, its face obscured. "You've come far," it said, its voice a low, rasping whisper. "Will you go farther?" I backed away, my heart pounding. The figure didn't move, but the lantern began to rise, hovering in the air like a firefly. "Stay," the whispers said. "We'll keep you safe. Follow the light." My mind screamed at me to run, but my body refused to obey. The air grew heavier, pressing down on me, and I dropped to my knees. Then I remembered the journal. "Do not trust the light. It will take everything." Summoning what little strength I had, I grabbed a rock and hurled it at the lantern. It shattered with a deafening crash, plunging the clearing into darkness. The figure let out an ear-splitting shriek, and the ground beneath me seemed to tremble. When I woke, I was back at Redwood Hollow, my gear exactly where I'd left it. The lantern was gone, and the air felt still, almost peaceful. I didn't stay to question it. I packed up and hiked back to the RV, never looking back. Weeks later, I received an anonymous package in the mail. Inside was my camera, which I'd thought I'd lost. When I reviewed the footage, it was corrupted, filled with static and strange distortions. But in the final clip, I saw myself wandering the forest, talking to someone who wasn't there. The last frame showed the lantern glowing in the distance, with the shadowy figure standing beneath it, watching me. Even now, I hear the whispers sometimes, faint and far away. They say the same thing every time: follow the light. My name is Marcus Hayes, and I was 29 when this happened. I had no idea that what started as a solo trip to Joshua Tree National Park, a journey to push my limits and find inspiration, would end with me barely escaping with my life. It was supposed to be about endurance, about challenging myself physically and mentally. I wanted to prove to my followers that I was more than a fitness vlogger, but the desert doesn't care about your plans. It only takes. I arrived at Joshua Tree late in the afternoon, my compact RV rattling as I navigated the dirt road to a secluded campsite near the Indian Cove area. The desert stretched endlessly in every direction, a vast expanse of twisted Joshua trees and jagged rock formations. It was quiet, almost too quiet, but that's what I wanted: isolation. As the sun dipped low, painting the landscape in hues of orange and gold, I set up my gear. My plan was simple: a week of grueling training runs, off-grid living, and capturing every moment on camera for my YouTube channel. I wanted my audience to see the raw beauty of the desert and the grit it took to conquer it. That first evening, I cooked a basic dinner and reviewed my route for the next day. I didn't notice the unease creeping in, the way the shadows seemed longer than they should, or the strange stillness that settled over the camp as night fell. The first run was brutal but exhilarating. The desert heat pressed down on me and the dry air burned my lungs, but I thrived on the challenge. By mid-morning, I'd covered over 10 miles, weaving through rocky trails and scrambling over boulders. I recorded a quick post-run video, the sweat pouring down my face as I grinned at the camera. "Day 1 in Joshua Tree," I said, my voice breathless. "Tough terrain, but nothing I can't handle. Let's keep pushing." But as the day went on, something felt off. No matter how much water or food I consumed, I couldn't shake the gnawing hunger that clawed at my stomach. It was deeper than physical hunger, a hollow, consuming need that left me restless and irritable. By evening, my unease grew. My camera had been acting up all day, recording static and distorted images. When I replayed footage of my run, I noticed something strange: fleeting shadows darting across the frame, too fast and too indistinct to identify. That night, I woke to a sound, a faint scraping against the RV. My heart pounded as I grabbed a flashlight and peered out the window. The desert was dark and still, the moon casting long shadows across the sand. When I stepped outside to investigate, I found tracks in the sand leading away from the RV. They were faint, but they didn't look like animal tracks. They were too long, too narrow. "Just the wind," I muttered to myself, though I didn't believe it. The second day began like the first. I pushed myself harder, running further into the desert, determined to shake off the unease. But as I ran, the hunger grew worse, gnawing at me with every step. Around midday, I stumbled across a patch of desert littered with bones, bleached and brittle, arranged in strange geometric patterns. At the center of the bone field, the air felt heavy, charged, as if the desert itself was watching me. The whispers started soon after. "Run faster!" I stopped, panting, and turned in a full circle. The desert was empty, the horizon stretching endlessly in every direction. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice swallowed by the vast silence. The whisper came again, low and guttural. "Go farther." I sprinted back to the RV, my legs burning, my breath ragged. By the third day, I was unraveling. I hadn't slept more than a few hours, plagued by vivid nightmares of running endlessly through the desert, a shadowy figure always just behind me. My runs were becoming disorienting. I'd set out for what I thought was a short jog, only to lose track of time and distance. That afternoon, I found myself standing in a clearing I didn't recognize. At its center was a jagged rock formation, its surface etched with symbols I couldn't read. The whispers grew louder here, circling me, urging me forward. "You'll never stop," they said. "You'll never leave." That night, the hunger became unbearable. No amount of food or water could satisfy it. My limbs felt heavy, my thoughts sluggish, and then the RV wouldn't start. I sat in the driver's seat, gripping the wheel as the whispers began again. This time, they weren't disembodied. A figure stood just outside the RV, its form barely illuminated by the moonlight. It was tall, emaciated, and shrouded in shifting shadows. Its head tilted at an unnatural angle, and its hollow eyes seemed to bore into me. "Run," it said, its voice a raspy hiss. I don't know why I obeyed. Maybe it was fear, or maybe it was the hunger driving me to move. I stumbled out of the RV and into the night, the figure always just at the edge of my vision. It led me back to the bone field. The air was freezing now, the whispers deafening. The figure towered over me, its limbs impossibly long, its face a void. "Finish the run," it said. My legs moved on their own, carrying me deeper into the desert. Every step felt like a battle, my body screaming for rest, for food, for relief. But I couldn't stop. The whispers pushed me forward, promising that if I ran far enough, I could escape. I don't remember how long I ran. Time blurred, the desert stretching endlessly before me. When I finally collapsed, the figure loomed over me, its shadow swallowing the moonlight. "You're mine now," it said, reaching for me. Desperate, I grabbed the nearest rock and smashed it against one of the bone patterns. The moment it shattered, the figure let out a guttural scream, its form twisting and dissipating into the night. I stumbled back to the RV at dawn, my body trembling, my mind shattered. This time, the engine roared to life, and I drove away without looking back. Weeks later, when I reviewed my footage, most of it was corrupted. Distorted images, static-filled audio. But one clip was clear, a shadowy figure trailing me through the desert, its hollow eyes watching my every step. The hunger never left me. Even now, I can feel it, gnawing at the edges of my mind. And sometimes in the dead of night I hear the whisper, "Run faster." My name is Jackie Ramirez, and I'm 34 years old. This happened during what was supposed to be a peaceful week of RV camping at Anza Borrego Desert State Park. I needed the break, not just from my work as a travel blogger, but from my life. After years as a paramedic, I thought I could handle anything. But the desert showed me how wrong I was. I arrived at Anza Borrego on a blistering afternoon. The landscape stretched endlessly, the jagged mountains and sun-baked canyons shimmering in the heat. It was the kind of beauty that felt alien, like stepping onto another planet. I parked my RV at a remote campsite surrounded by rust-colored rocks and set up for the week. That first day was perfect. I hiked through a slot canyon, my camera clicking away at the swirling sandstone formations. That evening, I sat outside under a sky littered with stars, enjoying the quiet. No city noise, no stress. Just me and the desert. The next morning, I stopped by the visitor center to learn more about the area. That's where I met Tim. He looked like he'd been carved out of the same rock as the park, his face lined from years in the sun. "First time here?" he asked, noticing my camera. "Yeah," I said. "It's incredible." Tim nodded, then leaned in conspiratorially. "You heard about the Borrego Phantom?" I laughed. "No, but I'm guessing it's a ghost story." Not just a story, he said, his voice dropping. Back in the 1800s, a prospector went mad searching for gold out here. Died in a sandstorm, they say. Now he haunts the Badlands, looking for something he'll never find. I smirked. You're trying to scare me. He shrugged. People have seen him, especially during windstorms. Just be careful. Before I left, Tim handed me a small talisman carved from desert ironwood. For protection, he said. I tucked it into my pocket, half amused and half touched by the gesture. The second day passed uneventfully. I hiked to Font's Point, an overlook where the Badlands spread out like a labyrinth below. The view was stunning, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I turned around a few times, but there was nothing, just the wind stirring the desert. That night, the whispers started. I was sitting outside the RV, stargazing, when I heard them. Soft, indistinct, carried on the wind. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but then they grew clearer. I couldn't make out words, but the tone was insistent, almost pleading. I stood and looked out into the darkness. In the distance, I saw a figure on horseback, barely more than a shadow against the starlit sky. "Hello," I called out. The figure didn't move. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it in their direction, but they were gone. My heart thumped in my chest as I retreated into the RV, locking the door behind me. It was probably just another camper, I told myself. Nothing to worry about. The next day, strange things began happening. My RV's lights flickered, though the batteries were fully charged. My GPS stopped working, the screen a tangle of static. When I went to refill my water jug, I found it tipped over, its contents spilled onto the dusty ground. Later, during a hike, I found an old pickaxe half buried in the dirt. It was rusted and worn, like it had been there for a century. Nearby, I noticed faint hoofprints leading into the canyon. A chill ran down my spine, but I forced myself to keep moving. Back at camp, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The whispers returned that night, louder this time. They seemed to be inside my head, accusing me, though I couldn't understand what they were saying. And then the storm hit. It came out of nowhere. A fierce wind that howled like a living thing, whipping sand and dust against the RV's windows. The temperature plummeted, and the air felt heavy, like it was pressing down on me. Through the swirling dust, I saw him again, the rider. This time, he was closer. I could make out his gaunt frame, his tattered clothes, and the hollow glowing sockets where his eyes should have been. He raised a skeletal hand and pointed at me, and I felt an icy dread settle in my chest. The whispers turned into words. Greed, betrayal, suffering. I scrambled to lock the windows and doors, but the RV felt like no protection at all. The rider vanished, but the storm raged on. And with it came something worse. Visions. I saw flashes of the prospector's life as though I was living it. His desperation as he searched for gold, the betrayal by his partner who stole his supplies, and his final, lonely moments as the storm consumed him. The pain and anger in those visions were so intense that I felt them as my own. The next morning, I found myself trembling, exhausted but alive. The storm had passed, but the phantom's presence lingered. I needed answers. I returned to the visitor center, but Tim was gone. In his place was a note taped to the door. It read, "You must break the circle." I didn't understand at first, but then I remembered the pickaxe and the hoofprints. They weren't random, they were part of a pattern. I retraced my steps, following the phantom's trail through the desert. As I pieced it together, I realized the pickaxe and other artifacts marked a circle, a boundary meant to trap the phantom's spirit. But the circle had been broken, its symbols eroded by time. Determined to restore the circle, I gathered rocks and began carving the missing symbols using Tim's talisman as a guide. Each time I completed a symbol, the air grew colder, and the wind picked up. The phantom appeared, trying to stop me. He loomed over me, his skeletal frame towering, his hollow eyes burning with anger. "You cannot undo this," he growled, his voice a mix of rage and sorrow. "You are no different from the rest." The wind howled, carrying sand that stung my skin, but I didn't stop. I carved the symbols with trembling hands, ignoring the phantom's accusations. I knew he wasn't just angry, he was in pain, trapped in a cycle of rage and despair. As I carved the final symbol, the phantom let out a deafening scream. His form flickered, his outline breaking apart like sand in the wind. The whispers ceased, and the desert fell silent. The oppressive weight in the air lifted, replaced by an eerie calm. I sat there for a long time, staring at the empty space where the phantom had stood. I didn't feel victorious, just drained. He was gone, but the scars he left behind, both his and mine, would take time to heal. When I returned to my RV, I hung Tim's talisman from the rearview mirror. It was a reminder of what I'd faced and survived. I eventually wrote about my time in Anza Borrego, but I left out the ghost story. Instead, I focused on the beauty of the desert, its resilience, and the lessons it had taught me. But in the final paragraph, I left a warning. The desert holds secrets older than we can imagine. Respect it, or it will remind you of your place. Even now, I hear whispers in the wind sometimes. They don't scare me anymore. They remind me of the phantom's story and of my own. My name is Jackie Ramirez, and I'm 34 years old. This happened last spring, during what was supposed to be a peaceful RV trip in Anza Borrego Desert State Park, California. I'd just left my job as a paramedic, a decision that still felt like failure, and I was trying to figure out my next steps. I thought the desert would give me the space to breathe, but I didn't know that it had other plans. The first day felt like exactly what I needed. I parked my RV at a remote campsite near the Badlands, miles from anyone. The desert was vast and silent, the kind of silence that presses against your ears. As the sun set, the sky ignited with stars, and I felt a little of the tension in my chest ease. The next morning, I stopped by the visitor center to grab a map and some advice about trails. That's where I met Tim. He was a retired ranger, and he had that weathered look of someone who'd spent more years outdoors than in. "You camping out here alone?" he asked, peering at my camera bag. "Yeah," I said. "Just for a few days. I'm writing about the park." Tim nodded. "Beautiful place, but it's got its stories." I raised an eyebrow. "Stories?" He leaned closer, his voice dropping. "Ever hear about the Borrego Phantom?" I shook my head, intrigued. "Back in the 1800s, a prospector went mad looking for gold out here. They say he died in a storm, and his spirit still roams the Badlands, looking for what he lost. People see him during windstorms, a rider on horseback watching, following." I chuckled nervously. Good for the article, I guess. Tim didn't laugh. Instead, he reached into his pocket and handed me a small talisman, a twisted piece of dark ironwood. "Take this," he said, "for protection." I hesitated but took it, more to be polite than anything else. The next 2 days were peaceful. I hiked to Font's Point, photographing the surreal folds of the Badlands stretching out below me. The landscape was eerie in its emptiness, but I felt safe in my solitude. That night, I sat outside the RV, stargazing and marveling at the sheer size of the universe. But on the third day, things started to change. It began during a hike. I found a rusted pickaxe half buried in the dirt. The wood splintered and gray with age. Nearby, faint hoof prints led into a canyon. My first thought was that someone else had been out here recently, but the tools looked ancient, and the prints seemed to end abruptly in the middle of nowhere. That night, as I sat outside my RV, I heard the whispers. At first, I thought it was the wind, but the longer I listened, the more it sounded like voices, soft and indistinct, carried on the air. I scanned the horizon, and that's when I saw him. A figure on horseback, silhouetted against the stars. He didn't move, just sat there watching me. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. No response. I grabbed my flashlight and aimed it at the figure, but when the beam landed on the spot, he was gone. I locked myself in the RV that night, my heart pounding. It was probably nothing, I told myself. Maybe my imagination or a trick of the light. But deep down, I didn't believe it. The next day, the desert felt different, heavier. My RV's lights flickered as I made breakfast, even though the batteries were fully charged. My GPS refused to work, the screen flickering with static, and then there was the water jug. I'd left it full on the counter, but when I turned around it had tipped over, spilling water across the floor. I didn't remember touching it. I tried to focus on my hike, but unease followed me like a shadow. The whispers started again as I walked through a narrow canyon, the wind funneling through the rocks. This time, they seemed closer, like someone was just behind me. I spun around, but the canyon was empty. When I returned to the RV, I decided to leave the park in the morning. But that night, the storm hit. It came out of nowhere. One moment, the desert was calm. The next, a howling wind slammed against the RV, shaking it violently. Dust and sand lashed against the windows, and the air inside turned freezing cold. Through the swirling dust, I saw him again, the rider. This time, he was closer. His skeletal frame seemed almost translucent, and his eyes glowed faintly, like embers in the dark. He raised one hand and pointed at me. The whispers turned into words. Greed, betrayal, suffering. My heart pounded as I scrambled to lock the windows and doors, but the RV felt like no protection at all. The lights flickered wildly, and the temperature dropped even further, my breath misting in the air. And then the vision started. I saw flashes of the Phantom's life as though I was inside his mind. His desperation as he searched for gold, convinced it would save him. His betrayal by a partner who abandoned him, taking their supplies. And finally, his death in a storm like this one, alone and consumed by rage. Oh, the pain in those visions felt real, like it was mine. I collapsed onto the floor, shaking. The storm passed by, mourning, leaving the desert eerily still. I stumbled out of the RV, exhausted and disoriented. The rider was gone, but his presence lingered, an oppressive weight in the air. I didn't know what to do, but then I remembered Tim. I drove to the visitor center, but it was closed. Taped to the door was a note in Tim's handwriting. "You must break the circle." I didn't understand at first, but the words stuck in my mind as I retraced my steps. That's when I saw it. The artifacts I'd found weren't random. The pickaxe, the hoof prints, even the talisman Tim had given me, they were part of a boundary. A circle meant to trap the Phantom's spirit. And somehow it had been broken. Determined to fix it, I used the talisman as a guide, carving the missing symbols into the rocks and sand. Each time I completed a symbol, the air grew colder, and the wind began to pick up again. The Phantom appeared, trying to stop me. He loomed over me, his form flickering like a mirage, his eyes burning with anger. "You cannot undo this," he growled, his voice a mix of rage and despair. "You are no different from the rest." I wanted to run, but I forced myself to keep carving. The symbols glowed faintly as I worked, the talisman growing warm in my hand. The whispers turned into screams, the wind howling louder, but I didn't stop. When I carved the final symbol, the phantom let out a piercing scream, his form shattered like glass, fragments of light scattering into the wind. The storm died instantly, and the desert fell silent. I sat there for a long time, shaking. He was gone, but I didn't feel victorious, just drained. His pain and anger had been real, and I'd been a part of it, whether I wanted to be or not. I left Anza-Borrego that afternoon, the talisman now hanging from my rearview mirror. I never saw Tim again, and part of me wonders if he was even real. When I wrote about the park, I focused on its beauty and resilience, leaving out the phantom's story. But in the final paragraph, I added a subtle warning. The desert holds secrets older than we can imagine. Respect it, or it will remind you of your place. Even now, I hear whispers in the wind sometimes. They don't scare me anymore. They remind me of what I faced and what I left behind. My name is Evan Grayson, and I'm 36 years old. Last summer, I drove my RV to Mount Shasta, looking for a break from the burnout that had taken over my life. I wanted clarity, a sense of purpose, something to snap me out of the fog I'd been living in. Instead, I found something I still can't fully explain. A darkness that wasn't just in the mountain, but inside me. I parked my RV at a campsite near Bunny Flat. It was beautiful. Snow-capped peaks, dense forests, and an unbroken silence I hadn't realized I needed. I spent the first day hiking and taking pictures of the trails, though I couldn't shake the feeling that the mountain was watching me. I laughed at myself for being dramatic. I wasn't the spiritual type, and all the talk about Mount Shasta being a vortex or a gateway to other dimensions was just noise to me. That evening, I stopped at a small cafe in town for dinner. It was one of those places where the locals all knew each other, and I stood out like a sore thumb. A woman sitting near the window noticed me fumbling with a trail map and came over. She introduced herself as Julia, a local healer and energy worker. "First time here?" she asked, her eyes sharp and curious. "Yeah," I said, smiling politely, trying to figure out where to go tomorrow. Her expression turned serious. "You're not here for the vortexes, are you?" I shook my head. "No, just looking for some peace and quiet." She nodded slowly, then leaned closer. "Have you heard of the Devil of Shasta?" I frowned. "The what?" "It's an old story," she said, her voice dropping. "They say there's a shadowy figure on the mountain, one that preys on people who are lost. Not just physically, but spiritually. It feeds on self-doubt, fear, and unresolved guilt. It twists your mind until you can't tell what's real and what's not." I laughed nervously. "Sounds like a great campfire story." "It's more than a story," she said firmly. "The mountain reflects what's inside you. If you're not careful, it'll show you things you're not ready to face." I thanked her and left, amused but unsettled. She seemed a little too intense for my taste, but her words stayed with me as I drove back to the campsite. The next morning, I hiked up one of the trails leading toward the summit. The air was crisp, and the forest was alive with birdsong and the rustling of leaves. But as I climbed higher, the atmosphere began to shift. The birds fell silent, and the trees seemed taller, their shadows darker. I noticed claw marks on a tree trunk, deep, jagged grooves arranged in a strange, almost deliberate pattern. They were too high up to be from an animal, and they gave me an uneasy feeling I couldn't shake. I snapped a picture and moved on. Back at the campsite, things got weirder. My journal, which I'd left closed on the table, was open, its pages filled with frantic scribbles I didn't remember writing. Words like failure, guilt, and lost were scrawled across the pages in my handwriting. My chest tightened, but I told myself it was a prank or my own sleep-deprived mistake. That night, I had the first dream. I was in my RV, but it wasn't my RV. The walls were warped, and the windows showed not the forest, but endless darkness. At the foot of my bed stood a figure, a tall, shadowy form with glowing red eyes. It spoke, its voice low and rumbling. "You're running, Evan, but there's nowhere to hide." I woke up drenched in sweat, the words echoing in my ears. The next day, my unease grew. I felt nauseous and lightheaded, like the air itself was pressing down on me. Shadows flickered at the edges of my vision, but when I turned to look, there was nothing there. Julia came by that afternoon, surprising me at the campsite. "I could feel it from town," she said, her tone urgent. "You're not okay." I wanted to argue, but the truth was, I wasn't. I told her about the dream, the journal, and the claw marks. She listened carefully, then said, "You need to leave, now. The devil is feeding on you." "I'm not buying into this," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. "It's just stress." "It's more than stress," she insisted. "It's using your fears against you. If you don't confront it, it'll consume you." I didn't know what to say, so I nodded and promised to think about it. But I didn't leave. That night, I saw it again. I was sitting outside staring at the stars when I noticed a shadow moving through the trees. It was impossibly tall, its outline flickering like smoke. The air grew icy, and the whispers started, low, unintelligible murmurs that seemed to come from everywhere at once. I grabbed a flashlight and shone it into the forest. The beam landed on the figure and it froze. For a moment, we stared at each other, its glowing eyes boring into mine. Then it moved, fast, too fast, and disappeared into the darkness. I should have gone inside, but something pulled me forward. I followed it into the woods, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The trees closed in around me, their branches seeming to reach out. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and then I saw it. A massive rock formation loomed ahead, its surface covered in strange symbols carved deep into the stone. The shadowy figure stood before it, its form shifting and writhing. "You want answers?" it said, its voice echoing in my mind. "Then face the truth." I woke up at the rock formation, clutching my journal. The pages were filled with new entries, ones I didn't remember writing. They weren't frantic like before. They were clear, detailed, and deeply personal. They listed every failure, every regret, every fear I'd buried over the years. My hands shook as I read them. Desperate, I drove into town and found Julia. I told her everything, and for the first time I felt like someone understood. She said the rock formation was where the devil's power was strongest, and the symbols were part of an ancient ritual meant to trap it. But the ritual had been broken, and the devil was loose. "We can fix it," she said, "but you'll have to confront it directly. It won't let you go otherwise." That night, Julia and I returned to the campsite. She brought candles, herbs, and a bundle of sage, setting up a protective circle around the RV. The air was heavy and the forest was deathly silent. The devil appeared just after midnight. It stepped into the circle, its form towering and menacing. The whispers rose to a deafening roar as it spoke. "You can't hide from me, Evan. I am every doubt, every failure, every lie you tell yourself." Julia began the ritual, chanting softly, but the devil's voice drowned her out. It turned to me, its eyes glowing brighter. "You want freedom? Then admit it. Admit you're nothing." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. My knees buckled, and for a moment, I felt like giving in. But then I thought of all the times I'd fought back, against doubt, against fear, against despair. I wasn't perfect, but I wasn't nothing. "I'm not afraid of you," I said, my voice shaking but firm. "You're not me." The devil let out a piercing scream as Julia completed the ritual. Its form dissolved into smoke, the whispers fading into silence. The forest seemed to breathe again, the weight lifting. I left Mount Shasta the next morning. The journal sat on the passenger seat, a reminder of what I'd faced and survived. I still don't know exactly what the devil was or where it came from, but I know one thing for sure: it forced me to face myself, and I'm stronger for it. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The mountain loomed in the distance, its peak shrouded in mist. I don't think I'll ever go back, but I'll never forget what it taught me. My name is Claire Winters. I'm 33 years old, a journalist, and, depending on who you ask, a mythbuster. My work centers on investigating urban legends and folklore, peeling back the layers of exaggeration to uncover the truth. I've exposed fake hauntings, uncovered illegal activities masquerading as ghost stories, and even debunked a UFO sighting or two. But what I experienced last summer in the Redwoods was different. What happened at that abandoned logging camp still chills me to the bone. It was mid-July when I drove my RV into the Redwood National and State Parks. The air was crisp and fragrant with pine, and the trees towered over me like ancient sentinels. I had come to investigate the legend of the Blood Lanterns. According to local lore, ghostly red lights floated through the forest near an old logging camp. The spirits of loggers who died violently during a strike gone wrong. It was the perfect story for my blog. A chance to dig into history, explore a haunting, and prove that the supernatural explanation was nothing more than old campfire tales. I set up camp at a remote site on the park's edge. The location was ideal, secluded, quiet, and not far from the trail I'd marked as leading to the abandoned camp. After settling in, I headed to a small visitor center to gather some background. The staff there knew little about the legend, dismissing it as folklore. But one man, an older ranger named Bradley, pulled me aside as I was leaving. "You're going after the lanterns, aren't you?" he asked, his weathered face creased with concern. I nodded. "That's the plan. Any tips?" Bradley sighed. "Don't follow them. If you see the lights, turn back. That place..." He trailed off, glancing over his shoulder as though someone might overhear. "It's cursed. Those men died angry, and they don't take kindly to visitors." I smiled politely, but brushed off his warning. I'd heard variations of this story countless times before. Curses, vengeful spirits. Usually they boiled down to old superstitions or someone covering up illegal activities. Still, his words lingered as I made my way back to the RV. The first night was uneventful. I spent it organizing my gear and reviewing old newspaper clippings about the camp. The articles detailed a labor dispute in the 1920s, where loggers protested dangerous conditions and withheld pay. The strike ended abruptly when a fire consumed the foreman's cabin, killing him and several workers. The camp was abandoned shortly after, its remnants swallowed by the forest. The second day, I hiked toward the camp. The trail was overgrown, the trees dense and silent, save for the occasional rustle of a squirrel or bird. About 2 miles in, I noticed strange marks on the trees, long, parallel gouges, as though something with massive claws had raked the bark. I stopped to take photos, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. As I ventured deeper, the air grew colder, and the sunlight struggled to penetrate the thick canopy. By the time I reached the camp, a heavy fog had rolled in, muffling the world around me. The camp was eerie, its structures barely standing. A few cabins leaned precariously, their roofs caved in, while rusted tools lay scattered on the ground. Inside one cabin, I found a rotting bunk bed in the faint smell of smoke, as though the fire from decades ago had never truly gone out. The foreman's cabin was the most intact, though its walls were blackened and brittle. Inside, I found a journal on a warped desk. The entries were sporadic, detailing the tensions between the workers and the foreman. The final entry, written in shaky handwriting, read, "They won't leave. Even in death, they won't leave." The hairs on my arms stood on end as I flipped the pages. A sudden noise, like a faint whisper, made me whip around, but the cabin was empty. That night, back at my RV, I tried to rationalize the day's events. The journal was unsettling, but it was likely just the musings of a frightened man during a chaotic time. The whispers? Probably the wind. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Around midnight, I saw them. At first, I thought they were flashlights, a faint red glow moving through the trees. But the lights were too steady, too deliberate, floating several feet above the ground. My heart raced as I grabbed my camera and stepped outside. The lights flickered and pulsed, moving in a slow hypnotic rhythm. I followed them, my boots crunching softly on the forest floor. As I drew closer, the air grew colder, and the forest seemed to shift. Trails I'd marked earlier were gone, replaced by gnarled roots and dense undergrowth. The lights led me back to the camp, brighter now, almost blinding. They floated in a circle around the foreman's cabin, casting eerie shadows on the blackened wood. As I approached, the door creaked open on its own. Inside, the red glow illuminated the room, revealing tools scattered across the floor, axes, saws, chains, covered in dried, rust-colored stains. And then I saw him. The specter of the foreman stood in the center of the room, his figure shrouded in smoke and his lantern glowing blood red. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow, and his voice a low guttural growl. "You shouldn't have come," he said, his voice reverberating through the cabin. "This is their place." The tools began to rattle, lifting off the floor as if pulled by invisible strings. They spun around me in a violent storm, the air thick with the smell of iron and smoke. I ducked as an axe whizzed past my head, embedding itself in the wall. Panicking, I stumbled outside, only to find myself surrounded by the lanterns. They flickered wildly, their glow alternating between crimson and a soft white light. For a moment, I thought I saw faces in the lights, weathered, sorrowful faces of the loggers. They seemed to be watching me, deciding my fate. Desperate, I raised the journal I'd taken from the cabin and shouted, "I'll tell your story. I'll let the world know what happened to you." The lights pulsed brighter, blinding me. The foreman's growl echoed behind me, furious and guttural. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the storm ceased. The lanterns flickered one last time before fading into the trees, leaving me alone in the clearing. I ran back to my RV, my heart pounding and my hands shaking. The forest was silent again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was still watching me. I packed my things and left before dawn, unable to spend another moment in that cursed place. In the weeks that followed, I wrote an article about the logging camp and the blood lanterns. I included the journal's contents and the history of the workers' struggle, framing it as a tale of forgotten lives and unresolved pain. The piece gained traction, sparking conversations about the history of labor disputes and the lingering scars they leave. But I left out the part about the foreman. I didn't include the lights or the storm of tools. Some stories are better left unfinished. Even now, I can't forget the faces in the lanterns or the foreman's shadowy figure. And sometimes when I'm driving late at night, I see a faint red glow in the distance, flickering through the trees. I don't stop. I don't look back.